And the over the year, first it was known as John Green's Field, then it was known as John Green's Swamp. Later, it's Green's Swamp, and today it just goes simply by the word Green Swamp. In 1795, it was appraised at 4.2 cents per acre. And this is when the state started deeding the land out to private individuals. Most of the original property was purchased in 1861 by the Green Swamp Company, which initiated large-scale logging operations. Logging camps sprung up in nearby communities of Nakatoki and Bolton. Local farmers used the fringes of the swamp as pastures for their hogs and for their cattle. They would let them run free for months and then gather them up at slaughter time. We know that the animals were distinguished by a mark on the ear, and each family's mark was registered down at the courthouse. Farmers and their families have always used the swamp for hunting, for trapping, and for fishing. Basically, tonight I'm going to concentrate on three families, more on one than the other two. In the Crusoe area was the Cluis family, and they live there still today, and their descendants. They were known as big bear hunters. Also, we got the area up around Juniper Creek, the Exum, Nakatoki area, and this is where the Phelps family lived. And then over on 211, just before you go into Columbus County around Camp Branch, are the Littles and that family. All these families were known for their for bear hunting, and also for their stories that they tell. And so I want to talk to you just a little bit and tell you some stories of the Green Swamp and the bears. Back in 1935, the CC boys had a camp, and it was called Camp Sapona. And Charles, his father, was one of the men that worked in, it was a CCC boy. And he said that they rescued a couple of small bear cubs from a forest fire that was roaring through their refuge in the Green Swamp. The rescue was not without danger to the boys, who had to work fast to fell the trees where the cubs were stranded. The cubs were kept at the camp for some time, and the boys were so proud of their rescue that they began to advertise in the newspaper, trying to find a home for the bears. And the advertisement became a classic. It was copied all over in many of the U.S. newspapers, and they were making a plea to the public to come and at the same time to refrain from setting fire to the woods, pointing out the great loss to animal life. They named the cubs Mike and Ike. And in July of 1935, they came to the attention of the State Department of Conservation and Development. Somehow Raleigh found out, the Conservation Department found out that these two bears had been given to a man or sold to a man down in Southport by the name of W.C. Long. And he came down, and of course, W.C. was not wanting to give up his pets, but the game officials had the law on their sides, and so they said you either got to turn them loose or turn them over to the authorities. Now, the bear has three weaknesses. Number one, corn. Number two, garbage. And number three is the tendency to tree. So I'll use that term, to tree, and simply they're running up a tree, and that's where they stay. And during hunting season, the water levels in the swamp are sometimes high, and not many bears are killed during that time. But what they do, there's a term called water the dogs. And so the bear can actually, as the dog is chasing the bear, the bear will lead them into the canals, into the deep water, and therefore they cannot be caught. And it makes it much harder to tree the bears. But we know that the persons living in or near the Green Swamp recall all these stories, and there are many stories that abound. And that's what they simply start out as, is simply a story. But over time, and the more and more that it's told, it takes on a life of its own, so to speak, and it becomes folk history. It may be folklore. It's called a tale, and then it's called a tall tale. And then it reaches that stage where it's called a colossal tale. And so you know what happens as the stories are told over and over. Arthur Little, his actual name was MacArthur Little, and he lived, as I said, over in the Camp Branch section. So when you're supplying, you're going through the grain swamp on 211, and the big map over here shows that. Just as you get ready to enter into Columbus County, there is a house sitting on your right, and that is the old Arthur Little house. Some family now maintains the house because he died many, many years ago. And Mr. Arthur Little was a great teller of stories, and his story is in one of the Kindle books over there. But I'm just going to shorten up and tell you about the time that he saved his daddy from being killed by a bear. At that time, he was working for Waccamaw Lumber Company. He was actually riding a bicycle. Can you imagine riding a bicycle down those dirt paths and trails up here, because there was at that time no paved 211. And he's over at his father's house that morning for breakfast, and his daddy Rufus tells him about a bear that has been bothering him, killing his sheep and destroying and raising havoc. And so he says to Arthur, he said, will you help me kill him? He said, no, I got to go to work. Got to be there by 12 o'clock. But he said, I'll come back by later and check on him. So later in the day, he comes out and he returns. And he says, I heard the dogs coming. I saw my father running down the road, stop, throw up his gun and shoot. He ran behind a thick bunch of bushes. And when he ran into the bushes, the bear came out and hit the road running. Right behind him was two dogs that was chasing the bear on either side, and they were pinching at him and making the bear mad. The bear hurls around, he grabs the dog up and he begins gnawing on him. He said, Dad broke from the bushes, ran across the road, pointed his gun right at him and fired. I saw the bear come up with him with both forefeet right in the chest. The bear bit his ankle 4 times because he said there were 12 holes. And then he moved on up to the muscle of his legs because there was 14 holes. And he left his left forefront on his stomach and was standing on it. And of course, I've shortened up the whole tale. It takes several pages to tell this. He said immediately his father rammed his right hand down the bear's mouth. And the bear bit him on the finger and the joints. He said, I flew on him like a cat. I had a little Smith & Wesson 6-shot squeeze pistol, and I shot it until it snapped. I turned the old bear's head loose, it flopped down and hit the ground. And he raised his old head back up and he looked right in my eyes. He opened his mouth, took his foot and moved it under his chin, rolled his eyes up, and he was dead. He laid that chin on the foot so pretty as padding for his head. I reckon he had a headache or something. And he goes on and tells about taking his daddy by buggy down to Bottigoli and South Shallotte and gets him worked on, and then the other people there take over, skin the bear out, and etc. But Mr. Arthur Little was a teller of tales, and so he did tend to move it beyond just the bear story to a little more than folk history, a little more than folklore, and maybe up to a tall tale. He also had a cousin by the name of Louis Napoleon Little, and he also talked with the state court pilot and tells about the time that he and Miles Little went hunting near one of the grain swamp cornfields. He names their dogs, Poor Boy, Wheeler, Tally, Bouncer, and Beaver. And he said it won't long before they picked up the scent of the bear. 6 hours later, they treed him. He said, I reached a tree, but the bear didn't see me approach. I shook a bush to get him to look at me so he could fire at him. He looked down and I shot him in the breast. He came tumbling down into the bushes at my feet. And there I was, down with bushes all over me, 5 dogs and the bear, wallowing and fighting like nobody's business. Eventually, the bear got away, ran off, and came directly back at me and jammed his nose against me where I stood tangled in vines. The dogs were so hot behind the bear, he turned and climbed another tree, and I shot at him, inflicting a fatal wound. The oldest bear story that I could find was 1858. And supposedly it happened in the Green Swamp between the river's mouth and Crusoe Island. There was a family of 7 living. The father had gone away. All the children, of course, had things to do. And the middle child, the middle girl, was the one who was churning the butter. And she said that as she was churning, she noticed that her dress kept coming up and falling against her leg. Finally, she looked down and she saw a long, black, hairy arm. Indeed, it was a bear reaching through the lower logs of the house from which some of the chinking had fallen. As you can imagine, the old log structures and how the chinking had come out between the logs. The bear had reached in and was grabbing a hold of her dress. So they tried to decide how to catch the bear. So what they did is they chose a slim pole and they prized the bottom log, and you know that lifts it up so that there's more opening now between the 2 logs this way. And so they got the pole stuck in and they prized it up. And the bear just stuck its front paw in. And when it did, they just let the log down and it caught the bear and held him there until the father could come the next morning and decide what they're going to do with it. That was 1858, and the oldest story that I could find. They've also taken bear stories and turned them into ghost stories. And you heard the one about a long time ago in horse and buggy days. There were no good roads. All they had or needed were buggy trails. Once a man saddled up his horse to go see his girlfriend. And the night when he was returning home, he came to a branch, but the horse stopped and wouldn't go across the branch. Said he surveyed around the area, couldn't figure out why the horse would not proceed. So he hit the horse with the side of the heel of his boot, and finally the horse began to move. When the horse jumped the branch, something clawed at him, but only struck the saddle. Apparently, the ghost was trying to pull him off the saddle. The horse bolted on across the water and raced on home. Later, when he unsaddled the horse, he saw claw marks on the leather and realized that it wasn't a ghost. Sometimes later, a bear was killed near the spot where he had been clawed. The Phelps dynasty, and I guess that's what you would call it, consisted of Lemuel Phelps, and he was the father of 4 sons and the grandfather of 16 grandsons. All of them were bear hunters, and they became a part of the legacy of the black bear hunters. One of them was Delmer Phelps. He had the nickname Bear Catcher. And I asked, where did the name come from? Why was he called Bear Catcher? And all we could figure out is that the nickname was given to him because of an incident when he killed a bear. He and his brother Aldrich went to check on a trap that had been set earlier. They found the bear caught in the trap, and Delmer hit him in the head with a pole and killed the bear. We know that we that know Bear Catcher and knew Bear Catcher knew that he was an eccentric man. He lived with his wife in a 2-room house on the Makatoki Road, which at that time was dirt. And one thing that was about him was he kept a diary. Remember the little fertilizer books that you used to get from fertilizer companies, little notepads? And he would keep a diary. And every day, and Hal showed me the diary, and it records the weather of the day and just a sparse entry of who he might have seen or whatever. During the late 1940s, there were large groups of bear hunters coming in from Tennessee. There was a great influx of those that were coming in wanting to hunt in the Green Swamp. There was a picture, and I went back today trying to find it in the newspaper, showing the Jeeps that they actually traveled in. They were like Army surplus Jeeps. And they came all the way from Tennessee in those Jeeps and all their dogs. And they come into the to, to hunt. And on one occasion, Bear Catcher and his brother Aldrich were serving as guides of a particular group that came in. They killed 3 bears, and one of them reported to be the largest, about 500 to 600 pounds that had ever been killed. Said it took 3 shots, all fired at different times during the chase to bring the big bear down. And he said the big bear is said to have been chased many times. The same bear is chased by all these men. Elwell Russ talks about chasing it, and also the brother Woodrow. Now, one of the Phelps men was Warren Phelps, and there's a little short article about him there. And Mr. Warren married Lorraine Fernside. Lorraine was the daughter of John, and I guess he had more notoriety nationally than anyone else, but something was written about him. So John Fernside, he gained notoriety for leading hunting parties all the way from Tennessee, Alabama, Texas, Oklahoma, into the grain swamp, looking not only for black bear, but also for deer and alligator. A lot of mail came to him. He got to be known through the news media and WB Causey and Southport. And I'll talk briefly about him, was the one who really got the story out about Rumsey County. And so Mr. Fernside was actually invited to go to Canada and bring his dogs with him to be shown there. And his grandson is David, who works here. And but Mr. Fernside was known, John, and the picture that's here on the table is of one of John's hunting expeditions. And he's the tall man, his granddaughter said, standing to the left. And so he, as I said, Mr. Fernside was known and got to be known, and newspapers were wanting pictures of him. And he said that the bears in the swamp are the very devil on dogs. Chases may last anywhere up to 24 hours. And even then, the bear may be lost through its getting to some inaccessible part of the swamp. He said he had a dog that had been killed, several had been mauled, and yet he was able to keep a fair pack of bear hands on hand. They were led by his lead dog, Betty. And she was a black and fawn colored hound, quite old, he said. Some of his other dogs were named Beaver, Pup, Lady, and Lou. Mr. Oliver Simmons was an elderly man that lived at the junction, or near the junction of Little Macedonia and Mackatoke. When you go up Settlers Road and then on up to starting up Mackatoke. Now remember, he had an old store across from his house in a log building. He lived near, as I said, there on the Mackatoke Road, ran a country store. And 2 of his daughters married into the Phelps family. So there's the connection there with Mr. Oliver Simmons. He told the roving reporter of the Stateport Pilot. The Stateport Pilot was formed in 1928 by W.B. Causey. I'll tell you about him he was hearing impaired, he was speech impaired, but he founded Stateport Pilot. The Stateport Pilot was printed in Bible at News Reporter. But he was not a very good businessman, but he was a real good writer. And so the News Reporter then, after he couldn't pay his bills, they had to take it over. And that's when the Harper family took over and started the Stateport Pilot. Causey was a writer of stories. He was called the roving reporter, and he would catch rides like with a tax collector. When he'd come out of Southport heading out to the country, anybody he could catch a ride with, he would. And he would go, and as the man stopped to collect taxes and the different things that had to be done for the courthouse, he would talk with the people, and there's where he got his stories. And that's why the State Fort Pilot has so many bear stories in this time frame of the 30s and the 40s. Here's what he said one day in 1948. He said, I'm getting right tired of bears and dogs and men rushing right through my front yard. One morning this week, I was enjoying the balmy weather from my front porch and became aware of an increased howling and yelling approaching through the woods. Pretty soon, a big bear ran right through the yard with what looked to be half the dogs in the county snapping around it. A very long time afterwards, and very much out of wind, John Fernside and a party of hunters puffed along chasing the pacer. We never heard if they got the bear. And so just a little short incident relating John Fernside into the Phelps family. Way back in 1890, there was a newspaper in Southport called the Southport Leader. And everybody would write the local news and would take it to Southport to be placed there. This happened in October of 1890. So get your time frame back. And this was Mr. Lemuel Phelps, which is Artie's great-grandfather. Okay. Mr. Lemuel Phelps and Simeon Hewitt had their bears had caught 2 of their cows. And so the neighbors collected, and with their dogs, they chased the bears away into the dense green swamp. Mr. Asbury Simmons, a faithful old bear hunter, heard the bear coming toward him. He waited patiently for him to get close, and when he got ready, he gave him a dose of Simmons's liver invigorator in the left shoulder. This was 1890, so I was talking the conversation, which laid him over. He cuts off the forefoot. It weighed 1 pound and 6 ounces. And he takes it to the editor of the newspaper in Southport to show it to him that he actually the size of the bear. I told this story has grown from 3 to many pages, and I told Dave I'd give it, clean it up and get it to him, put it in the newsletter for November, so you get to read it all. There was a man by the name of Rick Murray. It came through here back in the 80s, mostly the 90s. He came to my house one time and visited, talked to me about the green swamp. And he compiled a book, and it's the one over on the far end, the notebook. And he named the book Tales of the Green Swamp, Rumsey County, North Carolina, with biological notes. And what he did is he just went around, everybody he saw, he talked with them and recorded their stories. And many of them are short, but yet they have become a part of folk history, folklore, tales, tall tales, and one of them even made colossal tale. What happened, these men around Exham and up in these areas, they just didn't hunt by day, but they got together at night. They sat around and they would cook it by the campfire, and you know what happened? They'd cook and they'd eat, and then they would start telling stories, and there it went. Mr. Warren Phelps, who was a grandson of Lemuel and first cousin of bear catcher, lived about halfway through. Is it called Muddy? I thought the bridge there, is that Muddy Branch? No. I've always called it Jennifer Creek, but when I look on the map, but it's about halfway up the Maketoki Road. Mr. Warren Phelps' house is there. We talked about it earlier. And so he lived a little further close up to Exham in the Maketoki. And he tells of the time that he met a large bear. He was only 15 years old at the time, he said. And his father had given him the job to stay up at night to keep the fire going in the tobacco barn. And you remember how the old tobacco barns, they had to cure by wood fire. And someone had to stay up at night to keep the fire going so that the tobacco would cure out. So this was Mr. Warren's night to do that. And next to the barn was a field of corn, and bears had been absolutely tearing up the corn. So Daddy set a trap, a large steel trap, he said, with a quantity of heavy chain attached to it. The trap would work by first closing on the bear's leg. The bear would run off, he'd drag the trap in the chains, and eventually the chain would snag on trees and bushes, and the bear would be hobbled, and then he would be unable to move any further into the grain swamps. About 4 a.m., he said he heard the trap snap, and he heard the bear holler. Not knowing much about bear trapping, he said he knew he had to wait until it got light, and he followed the trail made by the chain, dragging through into the swamp, and it was tangled up on some bushes. And he said the head of the bear looked huge. It was a large bear. Well, all he had with him was a .22 caliber rifle with shorts, he said. And y'all that understand powder and all that know what he was talking about. So he said he started blinking away at the bear's head with his little 28. After about 6 shots, the bear went still. He was thrilled at what he had accomplished, and he knew his daddy would be pleased. He goes up to the house. He said, well, I got that bear that was taking our corn. Daddy heard it, and I told him how he killed it. And much to his surprise, he gave me a severe lecture, and he said, don't you ever try shooting a bear with a .22. He could break loose at any time. Really? And so I think the trap is still there at the house. It was according to Rick Murray, it's somewhere there into the house. Mr. Warren died in 2015. Okay, so he was 15, and then about 5 years later, he uses that .22 rifle again. He said there was a bear making free with the corn and other crops of the Phelps boys. And so he goes out and he pours a half dozen more shots into the bear. And the results in the engagement was one of a very dead bear weighing 400 pounds when it was dragged up to the scales. I mentioned Causey just a little earlier and why he was writing these stories. There is a neat article that was actually on the front page of the Pilot about the Phelps boys telling him he could go to the cold storage in Charlotte and get a bear ham anytime he wanted to, because he was writing all these stories about them. He said, so why all these hunting stories are being reported? He said it was all due to Causey, who, as I told you, founded the Pilot, and he would travel throughout the county. And in it, he was explaining why there were so many bear stories. He said once he encountered 3 of the Phelps boys, and they told him that when you want a bear ham, just go to the cold storage, you get it, it's right there at the cold storage for you. That was the slaughterhouse. There was one in Whiteville, and there was one in Charlotte, abattoirs, or whatever they're called. And they had freezer lockers where whenever they killed the animals, if you had a hog slaughtered, and they would cut it up, wrap it, put it there, freeze it for you, then you would go and pick up your frozen foods and all. And so he kept asking for information, and finally, Mr. Aldrich told him it was the same bear that he chased across the county one night last week when he came across it in a cornfield. He aimed to kill it with his pocket knife, but the bear outran him. And then Mr. Causey, who, as I told you, was known for his writing ability, he always was promoting hunting and fishing and tourism. He wanted everybody to come to Brunswick County, to Southport. Here's how he finished the article. He said, if someone would only add some Brunswick County venison, some Brunswick County squirrels, some Brunswick County shrimp, some Brunswick County fish, and some Brunswick County oysters to provide a bit of variety, in addition to the Brunswick County bear ham, he would throw a big feed at Holden Beach or somewhere and invite some newspaper folks down. And so he was this big promoter. Bruce Edwards, and I'm almost through, but I want to tell you about Mr. Bruce Edwards and a story that he tells of a encounter with a bear. And it's a story that just about everybody in the Green Swamp in the surrounding areas talked about. It seems that there was a commotion one night in Mr. Edwards's hog pen. He went to investigate, and in the dark, he saw a hog harassing one of the pigs. He climbed the fence, jumped down on the back of the hog. Mr. Edwards suddenly realized that this was a bear, not a hog. Presumably, he dismounted immediately and was not harmed. This incident is known in the area as the time Bruce Edwards rode a bear. Another man that wrote about stories of the area was called Roy Johnston. And his title of his book is Tales of Country Folk Down Carolina Way. He tells that one night 2 men went hog stealing. One climbed into the pen to catch the hog, and the other remained outside to receive it. Meanwhile, a bear came, or a porker, referring to the hog too. The man in the pen caught the bear and was ready to turn him over. The man outside, thinking his partner was taking too much time to catch the hog, said, "Man, have you got it?" Whereupon his partner replied, "Yes, but I can't turn him loose." Up in Crusoe was Buck Lewis, and he was one of the most an ancient, he's referred to as an ancient bear hunter. And he tells, this is a colossal tale, of how he once inadvertently caught the largest bear he ever saw. It happened in the dusk of every nightfall when Mr. Lewis was going about a shaded path in search of a sow that had wandered from her pen. And she was a valuable sow, and it would not allow her to wander around in the woods. A bear might get her. Presently, Mr. Lewis saw her ambling along a dark shadow. Being an agile man, he launched himself, aiming to land on her back and divert her toward the pen, and then he would ride her on home. But it was not the errant sow about whose neck he locked his arms. It was quite the biggest bear he ever saw, and the ensuing ride has become an epic of the swamp. He also tells about an old sow that he had with a litter of piglets, and they had gotten out of the pen, and he tracked them in the direction he figured that they had gone, and he sat in the woods waiting for them to show up. He heard some grunting, so he jumped out of his hiding place, and he surprised a big old black bear. He told this story for years, saying how you could hear that bear hollering for a mile. His wife always added that you could hear Buck hollering for 3 miles. And upon his death, as I told some of you earlier, State magazine, which today is Our State, but was then called The State magazine, upon his death, they devoted a whole page article to him, and they actually have a picture of him and wife, and then holding of a child in his arms. Buck Lewis, the old patriarch of Crusoe Island in Columbus County, one of the greatest bear hunters that the state has ever produced. So what about today? Are there any bear stories that are being collected and are going to be foretold in the future? Well, in 2011, and I have that article for you over there, Lucas Clemmons, a 5th generation bear hunter, brought down a 509-pound bear. He was 15 years old. And he's of the Clemmons family, up, as I said, up on Galloway Road and that way. So I can assure you that there will be many bear stories that he will tell about when he was 15 years old. And the story is well written. It was in the pilot. And so I'm sure it's going to be. So regardless of what you call them, stories, folk history, folklore, tales, tall tales, or colossal tales, everyone loves a bear story. Do come up and look at pictures and stories, and the map shows how it was with dirt roads and all. Okay.
You know, they used to bear hunting in the Green Swamp.
Yes.
Is it bears in a certain period of time?
Is it December now?
When?
2 weeks. Yeah, but they come in.
I live in Ash, by the beach, and I see signs up, there you go. Bear hunting, beware of the bear hunting.
Yeah.
You know, they're